Arthur stood in the center of his bakery, the air thick with the scent of stale flour and cooling stone. His fingers traced the jagged lines of the ceramic vase, mapping the history of its collapse. The clay was shattered, held together by nothing but habit and stubbornness. He lifted the pieces, feeling the weight shift unevenly in his palms. The edges bit into his skin, sharp and unforgiving. He tried to align the shards, but the base wobbled, the structure threatening to disintegrate entirely under his touch. He set it back down on the workbench with a soft, hollow thud. The silence of the room pressed against his ears, heavy and stagnant. He looked at the dust motes dancing in the dim light, then back at the web of fractures running across the surface of the pottery. Every crack was a failure he had lived with for too long. He pressed his thumb against a deep fissure, testing the gap, feeling the cold, rough texture of the break. Arthur pushed the heavy door open and stepped into the square. The transition was violent. The village was a blur of pristine surfaces, a landscape scrubbed of all history and wear. Every window pane caught the sun with a sterile, blinding intensity. Residents moved with rhythmic precision, polishing doorsteps until they gleamed like mirrors. Arthur held the vase against his chest, the jagged edges pressing into his palms. He moved toward the center of the market. A merchant stood on a raised platform, displaying a diamond statue that threw back the light in sharp, aggressive needles. The merchant adjusted the angle of the piece, ensuring the sun hit the facets to maximize the glare. He caught sight of Arthur and the uneven, broken clay in his hands. The merchant stopped his demonstration. He looked at the vase, then back at Arthur, his lips curling into a sharp, dismissive laugh that cut through the ambient noise. The sound echoed against the polished stone walls. People nearby slowed their pace, their eyes darting from the diamond statue to the ruin in Arthur's grip. The merchant turned his back. Arthur stood still, the weight of the vase suddenly feeling heavier than before, while the village continued its relentless rotation. A group of children drifted toward him, drawn by the contrast of the jagged pottery against the smooth pavement. They stopped a few feet away, their eyes locked on the web of fractures. One boy pointed a finger, his nail tracing the air in front of the vase. The children began to whisper, a low, rhythmic sound that rose and fell like the tide. They saw only the mess. Arthur looked down at his own hands. The skin was thick, calloused, and mapped with faint white scars from years of kneading dough. The whispers grew sharper, blending into the ambient noise of the square. He turned away, his boots scuffing against the pristine stone. He walked back to his workshop, the distance growing with every step. He pushed the door shut, locking the sunlight out. The silence of the room rushed in to meet him, pressing against his ears like deep water. He set the vase on his workbench. He stood in the dark, his scarred fingers trembling slightly, listening to the hollow echo of his own breathing in the empty, quiet space. The workshop was a tomb of unfinished ideas. Arthur stared at the vase, his fingers brushing the jagged edges one last time. He could sweep the shards into the bin. He could start again with fresh, unblemished clay. Instead, he turned toward the furnace. He stoked the embers until they roared, the heat radiating against his face. He reached for a heavy iron crucible, the metal handle biting into his calloused palms. Inside, a small pool of gold began to liquefy, glowing with a soft, molten intensity. He did not hesitate. He lifted the crucible, the weight pulling at his shoulders, and moved toward the workbench. He held the vessel steady, his breath slowing to match the rhythm of the cooling air. He tilted the crucible. A thin, glowing stream of gold poured into the deepest, most jagged crack. It hit the clay with a sharp, violent hiss. Steam rose. He watched the metal harden, the dull clay now bisected by a vein of light. He picked up the tool again, ready to trace the next line. Line by line, the gold flowed. Arthur worked with a surgeon's precision, guiding the molten metal into every hairline fracture. The vase began to change. It was no longer a collection of broken pieces held together by desperation, but a map of golden rivers, a sprawling, glowing geography of survival. He did not rush. Each pour was a deliberate act of defiance against the sterile perfection outside his door. In the village, the windows were scrubbed until they vanished into the air, and the statues were polished until they mirrored nothing but the empty sky. He could hear the distant rhythm of the town, the constant, obsessive scraping of stone against stone. They were preparing for the grand exhibition, a display of flawless, cold glass that left no room for history or struggle. Arthur wiped sweat from his brow, his hands steady despite the hours of labor. The vase sat on the workbench, now a heavy, intricate web of light. It felt different under his touch. It was rigid, solid, and entirely honest about the damage it had endured. The deadline drew closer, a silent pressure mounting in the room. He set the crucible down, the last of the gold cooling. The vase was finished. It was ready to be seen. The exhibition hall echoed with the sound of footsteps on polished marble. Arthur walked toward the center, the weight of the vase balanced carefully in his hands. The room was a gallery of sterile perfection. Glass statues caught the overhead lamps, throwing back a blinding, uniform glare that made the air feel thin and cold. He reached the central pedestal. He set the vase down. The sound of ceramic meeting stone was a sharp, final click in the quiet. He stepped back, his hands dropping to his sides. The contrast was immediate. While the surrounding pieces were smooth, transparent, and hollow, his vase stood heavy and scarred, its golden veins catching the harsh, artificial light in a way that felt aggressive. A merchant standing nearby turned, his gaze sweeping over the vase with a sharp, dismissive squint. He did not look for beauty. He looked for flaws. A group of onlookers drifted closer, their faces tight with skepticism. They pointed at the golden lines, whispering behind their hands. The silence in the hall shifted from respectful to judgmental. Arthur stood his ground, his back straight, watching as the crowd formed a tight, unyielding circle. He waited for the sun to move. The sun dipped toward the horizon, sliding beneath the high arched windows of the hall. A single, amber beam stretched across the floor, cutting through the artificial glare. It hit the vase. The golden cracks did not merely reflect the light, they seized it. The metal veins caught the beam, trapping the intensity and fracturing it into 1,000 jagged, dancing shards of color. The light spilled outward, crawling across the marble floor and climbing the walls in a web of brilliant, shifting patterns. The hall, once dominated by cold, uniform brightness, was suddenly alive with movement. The golden glow pulsed. Onlookers, who had been whispering moments before, fell silent. They stepped back, shielding their eyes as the light intensified, turning the air into a shimmering, golden haze. The patterns moved across the ceiling, tracing the geometry of the cracks. The golden glow deepened, saturating the air until the hall seemed to vibrate with color. Beside the pedestal, the diamond statues that had once caught the light with sterile precision now stood silent and drained. Without the harsh overhead lamps, they looked hollow, gray, and lifeless. The crowd turned away from the glass displays. They moved toward the vase, their faces illuminated by the dancing, golden patterns. Every wrinkle, every line of surprise, and every wide-eyed stare was caught in the light. The merchant stood frozen, his gaze locked on the golden rivers that bound the broken shards together. He reached out, then pulled his hand back. The surrounding perfection had vanished, rendered insignificant by the brilliance radiating from the cracks. The onlookers stopped whispering. They watched, mesmerized, as the light poured from the very places that had once been shattered. It was a total reversal of expectation. The crowd remained motionless, trapped in the glow, witnessing the truth that the cracks were not failures, but the only paths for the light to enter. Arthur watched from the periphery of the hall, his back pressed against the cool stone of a pillar. The golden light continued to spill across the floor, but he no longer needed to see the reaction of the crowd. He had seen the truth in the way the light moved through the cracks. He turned, his boots making no sound on the polished floor. He did not look back at the pedestal. He pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the evening. The air was cool, smelling of damp earth and the coming night. The sun was a thin, burning sliver on the horizon. He walked down the center of the square, his hands tucked deep into his pockets. He felt the calluses on his palms, the rough skin from years of labor, and for the first time, he did not try to hide them. The weight of the vase was gone. He passed the merchant's stall, now empty and dark, and continued toward his workshop. The village was quiet. The windows he had once envied for their transparency now seemed unremarkable. He reached his door, turned the key. He stepped inside. The room was dim, smelling of flour and dried clay. He stood in the center of the floor. He was not broken. He was simply ready. He took his hands from his pockets, flexed his fingers. Tomorrow, he would begin again.